in Israel and what it means for the future of Israeli democracy and for Israel's broader role in the Middle East. We are pleased and honored to have with us this morning the Honorable Aida Touma Suleiman, an activist and journalist by profession. Ms. Touma Suleiman is a member of the Hadash party and holds the 5th slot on the joint list in the Israeli Knesset. You have full bios for our speakers on the website, so I'm going to try to go do introductions as quickly as possible to maximize our time for discussion. Second, I'd like to welcome Dr. Delia Scheindlin. Dr. Scheindlin is a co-founder and columnist at 972 Magazine, a fellow at the Century Foundation, a policy fellow at MITVIM, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and she co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Ari Heistein. Mr. Heistein is a researcher and chief of staff to the director at the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. His research focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and Israeli strategy vis-a-vis Iran and the Yemen civil war. Although this is a virtual meeting, we will be taking questions from the audience through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with the hashtag MEI-events or email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function in Zoom or email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the panel. We will be checking in periodically to try to incorporate as many of those questions as possible into the discussion. And then hopefully we'll try to get back to the audience questions at the end of our round of questioning with our panelists. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Scheindlin. Dalia, we've seen a lot of drama in Israeli politics in the last few weeks, most dramatically the March 26th decision by Benny Gantz, who was in the opposition, to join Netanyahu in a unity government, which ended up breaking up his blue and white coalition. Now we see that President Rivlin is saying he will not extend Gantz's mandate to form a government, and that we have essentially until his mandate will expire at midnight tonight, Israel time, of course. Could you break down for us where things stand? Will there be a unity government, or will we see a fourth election?
If you're asking me to predict, I'm not going to fall into that trap. But I mean, this is a very serious, high-stakes game. You know, we've had many unprecedented things happen to us over the last number of weeks, but all year, Israelis have been facing a situation of unprecedented dysfunctional politics. We have been unable to form a coalition after 3 consecutive elections. That's never happened before, even once. So we never thought any of that was possible. I think that it would be madness for the country to go into elections now as a citizen, not even as an analyst. And it's hard to know what is the psychology behind any of the major players. I will maybe go back and just say that this was not an entirely unpredictable deadlock, just to remind everybody that the so-called opposition makes it sound like a unified bloc, but this was essentially a strange group of parties that had very little in common. These are the parties that won 62 out of 120 seats in parliament, Israel's Knesset. For anybody who doesn't know, we have a parliamentary system. You need a majority to form a coalition. So Netanyahu's loyalist bloc, the right-wing parties, had only 58 seats. And I call them the loyalist bloc because it's not sufficiently accurate to describe them as the right-wing bloc, considering that one of the most important right-wing parties joined the 62-seat opposition bloc. So the opposition bloc, as you put it, runs from a sort of nationalist right-wing party, which is the party of Avigdor Lieberman, all the way through to the Joint List, which is the party representing the majority of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the sort of Zionist left, the merged party of Labor, Gesher, and Meretz, which is now no longer. We have lots of former parties. And so those 62 seats, were united in the desire to put the country on a different track and, replace Netanyahu and change the direction of where the country was going, but they had no unified vision over what that direction should be. As a result, they did manage to unite for one moment, which was to recommend that Gantz be given the mandate to form the government. And that was an unusual alliance. Even that moment of, for example, Lieberman's party agreeing with the joint list to make that recommendation. I think that, those parties took a risk in doing that. I should also point out they were not even 60, they were at that point not even 62 seats anymore, because one of that 62 seat block had already essentially taken herself out and defected. Now she has formally defected to the right-wing bloc. Anyway, Gantz had the mandate. He was under too much pressure from other right-leaning figures in the opposition group to be able to consider forming a government without Likud. It would have been a minority government, hopefully, or if it had been established, it would have had the support of the joint list in a vote of confidence. But he didn't seem to have the courage to do that. He was worried about these sort of right-leaning members of the opposition party. And then, as you mentioned, instead of trying to take that route, he agreed to go into a unity government with Netanyahu, which created such a rift within his own party. Remember, his own party is a coalition of 3 other parties, like many parties in Israel. They broke apart, as you pointed out. 2 of those factions stayed within the opposition. Gantz's faction was joined by the 2 right-leaning defectors, the 2 right-leaning figures within Blue and White who never wanted the unity government. They joined him. And so all of ever since March 26, there has been an assumption that that was the major compromise, that was the breakthrough, like it or dislike it, whether you voted for him or not, at least there would be a government. But since then, strange things have happened. The 2 sides have been unable to agree. The idea of a unity government between Likud and Blue and White, and presumably the other Netanyahu loyalist parties, hit a deadlock. As far as we know, and I think we'll talk about this later, the deadlock came over one very technical issue of how the judicial appointment committees would be managed in Israel. And so this is what both sides are reporting was the final kind of sticking point, where Likud wanted more control. Blue and White said, we will not let them have that control. That would be changing how the judicial appointment committees are run. And everybody thinks there's other political forces at play. Maybe Netanyahu doesn't really want this deal. But I think that hopefully we'll talk about later why, of all the major issues going on now, the nature of the judiciary and this technical issue of the judicial appointment committees became at least the excuse for the sticking point that is causing these negotiations to collapse, essentially, unless something happens before midnight. It looks like we don't have a government. The president has refused to extend the mandate for forming a government to Gantz, and has said he will not give it to Netanyahu. Therefore, by law, it goes to the Honorable Aida Tuma Sliman and 119 other Knesset members to come up with somebody else who might win the support of 61 recommendations to form a government. We've never put that to the test, and I don't know if it will happen now. Although during that time, theoretically, the 2 sides, Likud and Blue and White, what's left of Blue and White, could still come to an agreement while the Knesset is trying to determine that alternative. So we're in for a lot of surprises, which is why I'm not taking any bets, but nobody can rule out 4th elections. And it's really a matter of chances. Do you think we have an 80% chance of government versus 4th elections, 20%, or the opposite? I'm going to still put my money on having a government because of the severity of the crisis, probably a unity government. I don't know if it will be by tonight at midnight or over the next 21 days. And I think that the country will probably avoid 4th elections. And it will be a Likud and Blue and White government with most of the right-wing parties, maybe with some surprises. That's my guess for now.
Okay, I think I want to go next to MK Ida, and obviously the joint list had taken a major risk in getting behind a Gantz-led government and endorsing him to form a government. And then I'm sure you all were extremely taken aback, or were you taken aback by his decision to break up his own coalition and join Netanyahu in a unity government? Was it a mistake for the joint list to back Gantz's coalition? And where does it leave the opposition in Israel? Is there a unified opposition? Is there more than one opposition? If you could unmute.
People would love to have me on mute. Anyway, I have to, yes, I have to say, first of all, that no, of course, the joint list don't evaluate the recommendation we had for the President of Israel to recommend that Gantz will have the mandate to form a government as a mistake. We don't see it as a mistake. We think that that was the only option politically serving our goals at that point and at that time. Why I'm saying this? Because automatically, if we did not recommend on Gantz at that point, it would have been automatically that Netanyahu will have the possibility or the mandate to form the government, the next government. We were very aware of the situation. We did not support Gantz coalition. We have to say that very clearly. At that point, even Gantz did not have a coalition. Dalia just spoke about two camps that existed in Israel, the 62 and 58, that are now 59 and 61. In my opinion, this is not Gantz and Netanyahu camps. It is the camp who is supporting Netanyahu, yes, but on the other hand, it's the anti-Netanyahu camp. It's not as if there is a camp on Gantz's side or a coalition that existed and we supported that coalition. What we wanted to do is to stop the possibility or to block the possibility for Netanyahu to get the mandate again. All the negotiations with Gantz at that point, with blue and white, and I was one of the negotiators, were concentrating on two issues: the recommendation and the different parliamentarian steps that were supposed to take to be taken immediately after Gantz getting the mandate, so that we get a more democratic possible Knesset that is able to act and to proceed on legislations and to legislate what is called anti-Netanyahu law, which is a law that forbids from the president to give a mandate to form a government to a candidate who is suspected or is persecuted for legal issues, for criminal issues. That was the negotiation. We were not proceeding toward a negotiation on the government itself. We were still far from there. We were cautious because we saw the conflicts inside that camp, because we understood that Gantz is not, does not have the courage or the political vision that enable him to go forward and to form a government that will shift the whole politics in Israel from a situation where it is controlled by Netanyahu and his right-wing government into a new situation. I think we have to be to understand that even if today the government will be not formed, there is still more possibilities that they will go for, and I don't call it unity or emergency government. This is a Netanyahu government. Gantz just crawled into Netanyahu's government, and it is not a unity government or any type of other government. If it was an emergency government, they wouldn't have dealt so much in other details, including the judiciary system, and it is not a technical issue at all. I don't agree that the judicial issue is a technical issue. It is very much toward what Netanyahu said 4 days ago when he declared that there is no democracy in Israel, there is a deep state in Israel, which means he wants to, in his opinion, there is no possibility to create a democracy when there is a deep state. And in his opinion, the Supreme Court is part of the deep state, and he wants to eliminate it and he wants to change it so he can be able to continue to control in such situation. We believe that there will be a government. I think there will be a government in the next few days, even maybe tonight, because already Netanyahu got what he wants from Gantz concerning the annexation of Palestinian occupied territories. He's going to get some kind of compromise on the judicial system because Gantz don't have anything else to do at this point. And they will continue on this government, I think, for another year until we pass the Corona COVID-19 issue, and then Netanyahu would like to go to election again.
Great. Thank you, Ida.
Can I just clarify one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
I did not, I wasn't implying that the judicial selection committees were a technical issue, but that they look to outsiders who are used to thinking about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or other issues. It looks like a technical issue, but I agree completely. It's a very substantive key issue.
Yeah.
Thanks. Speaking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm wondering, Ari, could you tell us, given the situation, not only the turmoil in Israeli politics, but obviously all of this is happening against the backdrop of a major global pandemic that has really consumed not just the Israeli government, but every government in the world virtually. What does the current situation mean for the Palestinian arena? The deal of the century was released just a few weeks ago in January. Is that still relevant? Is the situation on the ground more or less conducive towards an arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians?
So I think for the time being, it's safe to say that the ultimate deal is on hold as the world copes with the coronavirus. Palestinian issue had sunk pretty low on the international agenda for the past several years, and I think it's likely to fall off the radar for the next 6 to 12 months as the world seeks to recover from the pandemic. But after years of asking the world not to be so focused on the Palestinians, I think Israelis are starting to actually realize some of the downsides of being left alone with the conflict, particularly regarding humanitarian support and donations. And I think it's also important to mention that the situation is not static, but it's actually deteriorating. In Gaza, there's a humanitarian catastrophe on the horizon. In the West Bank, I think it's hard to argue that the continued reign of an aging, ailing leader with no clear successor makes things more stable. And then, of course, Israelis are subject to rocket fire from Hamas. And the two-state solution appears about as far away as it has in recent memory. So my take on the conflict, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, is that the two-state solution is the worst plan for resolving the conflict, except for all of the others. All that said, I think Israel needs to do a bit more than just win the blame game vis-a-vis the Palestinians over who is the spoiler of the peace process. At the same time, Israel's approach must be tempered with a healthy dose of reality. I don't think there's really any permanent agreement in the offing. So where does this leave us? Well, the next steps ahead are based on research conducted at the INSS, recommendations that we have devised. I think first, it's important to reverse the negative trends, putting the two-state solution at risk. The growing military power of Hamas, the erosion of the PA, creeping Israeli entanglement in the West Bank. I think instead we should be working towards conditions conducive for an agreement, improving the reality on the ground. That includes confidence building measures, stopping settlement building outside of the blocks, capacity building of the PA so that if a Palestinian state is established, it will not fail, and figuring out how to cope with the Palestinian political split between Hamas and Fatah. In parallel, I think there should be a return to negotiations, and this should be done under the auspices of regional and global stakeholders through a major international conference on peace. Presumably, the basis of the negotiations will now be the Israelis will come with the Trump parameters, and the Palestinians would join with the Arab Peace Initiative. That said, if the Palestinians are unwilling or unable to play ball and work towards resolving the conflict, I think Israel should consider how to work with international partners to coordinate demarcation of boundaries based on two aims. The first is improving Israel's national security, which includes not causing harm to peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. And the second is maintaining the possibility for a Palestinian state to emerge in the future. To be clear, I think that unilateral action as a first resort would be a serious mistake, but not considering coordinated independent steps as a last resort would be tantamount to providing the Palestinian veto on Israel's core interests, such as demarcating boundaries.
Thanks, Ari. A question to both Aida and Dalia on the Palestinian front. You know, we've seen, you know, Aida, you mentioned annexation is a point of agreement now between Gantz and Netanyahu. So moving forward, I mean, I think Ari laid out kind of the ideal scenario of a return to negotiations and confidence building measures. Can those things happen in the current environment, not just because of the turmoil in Israeli politics, but because everyone is literally caught up and consumed with the COVID crisis? But what does the future look like for, you know, is annexation going to happen? I mean, is it something that we need to factor in, and can you have negotiations once that has taken place? Let's start with Aida, and then Dalia, if you want to weigh in as well.
Well, first of all, I'm really sorry I didn't capture all what Arya said because I had a little bit of bad connection at that time. But I think that first of all, with the current situation, because of many reasons, because of the division on the Palestinian side, because of the crisis, the COVID crisis, because of the political crisis also in Israel and the deadlock that we are in, I don't see how we can start any serious steps toward getting a political agreement on the issue of occupation and continuous occupation. In my opinion, the dangerous side of the equation is the fact that the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, is insisting very much because of what I believe it's not because of the influence only of the settlers parties, but mainly also because this is what Netanyahu aims to, is to implement the annexation. And it might start with annexation using the world that is not paying attention to what is happening in the backyard of the Palestinian territories, and using the cover of the crisis that is happening in the world, and doing steps toward annexation in order to block any possible future solution that can be reached between Palestinians and Israelis. I think that it is a real danger that is standing in front of us. During the negotiations between Gantz and Netanyahu, the issue of annexation was a major issue, and they agreed that it will be implemented in 2 or 2.5 months only. So I think that Netanyahu knows very well that the world, which is very much busy with the COVID crisis, will not pay attention, especially if it starts with the settlements, which looks like, okay, there are citizens and it's already there a kind of a discourse that is going on as if the settlements is already by at least the Israeli side and the American side. The settlements are going to be annexated by the deal of the century to Israel. So they might start with not the Jordanian Valley, but the settlements. So it will go under the radar of the COVID crisis and nobody will pay attention or really have a big fight on that. And that will block, in my opinion, Netanyahu will use all his means until the elections in the United States, because he knows very well that President Trump needs the evangelical and the Jewish community in the United States in order to be re-elected. He will use that and he will stretch it to the edges and put new facts on the ground by implementing annexation.
Shall I add to that? Yeah. I mean, I'll basically agree with a lot of what Ida said, but I just want to tell a very short anecdote. You know, I think the two-state solution has been in grave danger, if not already dead, in terms of the political possibilities of reaching it. Have been very seriously, you know, challenged over the last number of years. But and by way of illustrating this, I often report that in Israel we never see the green line, not on not on the nightly news, not on the weather reports. Israelis don't think about it much. All of a sudden, during the COVID crisis, I was watching TV and they were mapping out where there are some COVID hotspots. And all of a sudden, for the first time in years, I saw a green line. And I was shocked and I wrote about it on Twitter and somebody wrote back, "You're such a liar and a self-hater," you know, people who troll. And I said, "Why am I a liar?" And he said, "There's no green line. You'll see, there's going to be a government and we will annex and then you'll see the green line is meaningless." And I said, "So we agree on the facts." And the strange thing is that it's a bizarre moment when I think both right wing and left wing generally have kind of acknowledged that this is what the next government is planning to do. It feels like a juggernaut. The only remaining question is how and where. And I think just to add, you know, a couple of things to think about with relation to Ida's analysis of how it will happen. We hear right-wing figures now from some of the further right parties talking actively about annexing the entire area of what they call Judea and Samaria and laying the legal groundwork for that. This is one of the reasons why it's important to them to weaken the power of the Supreme Court so that it will be harder to challenge legislation that might, or challenge, legislation for annexation and also challenge appeals against these kinds of moves. So I think that they're also trying to push the bar towards the maximalist approach so that if Netanyahu tries to undertake something like annexing settlements or the Jordan Valley or particular settlements, that will look like nothing, you know, no big deal, because the full vision of Israel is this total annexation. There are a few options. It could be annexing the Jordan Valley. It could be annexing settlements, as Ida pointed out. I think that there's also a possibility Netanyahu will float a test balloon of annexing just one settlement. For example, Ma'ale Adumim near Jerusalem, which I've done survey research, and this is public data now showing that 80% of Israelis support it. Of course, it's much higher even among Israeli Jews because Arab Palestinian citizens support it at a lower rate. But the average is 80%. I'm sure Netanyahu is seeing similar findings, and assuming that this is a consensus, he may just do these incrementally or build in the neighborhoods outside of Jerusalem that connect Ma'ale Adumim. I don't think there's any possibility of a coordinated international response in that case. We don't see any indication of that, especially not at a time of crisis. And with relation to what you said about Trump, that's an interesting approach, Ida, that he wants to give a boost to the evangelical communities. I didn't think of it that way, but I did think of it in the sense that he knows that Trump might not win. in November. And, he might very well want to just rush the timeline as long as there's a friendly president in the US on the assumption that he might not have that again, or at least not a pro-annexationist government in the US. So I think that we have lots of circumstantial support for advancing some form of annexation, although I think it will still take an incremental form and probably see very little by way of international pushback.
Great, thanks, Dalia. Ari, what do you think the COVID crisis means for in the Palestinian arena? Can you have negotiations or some sort of a process in the midst of this crisis? Not to mention against the backdrop of all of this annexation talk and quite possibly action on the ground.
So my guess is that actual negotiations will have to be put on hold for a little bit, but I don't think that means that necessarily there's nothing to be done to reverse the negative trends that are ongoing. I think that there are certain things that I had mentioned, including confidence building measures, which I guess would include the increased cooperation that we've seen between the two health systems. And then also I think not building settlements beyond the major blocks, I think would be a gesture that would advance, it could potentially advance a two-state solution. I think that there are things that can be done, but I think anything major will probably have to wait for a little bit.
Ida, did you want to weigh in on something? Sure.
Yes, well, Khalid, I think that the major obstacle in getting any negotiations done in the next future is not the COVID crisis or anything like this. It's the fact that the Israeli current government do not want to negotiate anything. This is the major issue. This is the major obstacle. As long as this kind of policy is still existing in this government, as long as Netanyahu want to annexate and to create the greater Israel state, not land, he doesn't feel why he needs negotiations. And not building settlements outside the big blocks or not building outside, it's not a gesture. It is what it's supposed to be, because the international law say very clearly that settlements are a crime. So I think a war crime, I think it's about time to understand that without changing that kind of discourse, we are not going anywhere.
So if I can just respond, I think there's plenty of blame to go around in the situation for the lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian front. I think the Israeli government deserves some of that, but I think that at the same time you have certain structural problems, let's say the Hamas-Fatah divide, which makes any real progress virtually impossible for the time being. And that's why the best thing you can do seems to be making changes on the ground, changing some of the trajectory of the conflict so that you can move towards a place where an agreement could be possible in the future.
I wanted to turn back to the COVID crisis and talk a little bit about that. Ida, given your role as chair of the Welfare and Labor Committee, which deals with the current coronavirus pandemic, what are the long-term implications of the COVID crisis in terms of the role of the state, as you see it, in providing basic services? And maybe more broadly, what does it mean for Jewish-Arab relations and cooperation in Israel?
Well, first of all, I think that the COVID crisis have make it very clear that this crisis came on an infrastructure that was economic and social infrastructure that has deteriorated in the last 10 years, even health services also. And it's now we are dealing with a crisis over a crisis. and we have to try to find solutions. In my opinion, that the state is not fully taking responsibility for. The support that the Israeli government is giving to the health system at this level, and to the economy and welfare to the citizens in general, is very low if we compare it to what is happening in other countries, even in the United States. If we take into consideration that only around 6 or 7% of the national income is invested at this point in trying to avoid the crisis and the implications of the crisis, we can see very clearly that large groups inside the employment market in Israel are facing a situation. First of all, the unemployment have raised till today to 25%. The compensation that is given for unemployment by the government at this point is very low. It's even hardly reaching 60% of the previous income of the people. Large and millions of people who run their own businesses are not given enough support to go through this crisis. After this, hopefully, after we manage to deal with the health situation, we will continue to face high unemployment among the population. We will face situations of poverty. The economy will be damaged in a severe way that will take us at least 3-4 years to maybe rebuild back the situation as it was before, and it wasn't the best before. We have to take into consideration also that different groups inside the society is more damaged than the others. If we remember that the Palestinian community in Israel before the COVID-19 was a crisis, had the higher numbers or statistics of unemployment and poverty in Israel. We believe that after the crisis, these statistics will be higher, and more unemployment and poverty will be seen in that society. The same, of course, with the Haredi population. We will see that if the economy is not generated back very quickly, and it's going to take few months to go, it will be a catastrophic socio-economic replications to this crisis, for my regret.
Dalia, as far as the COVID crisis and the situation with regard to the Palestinians, do you see any impact there? Is the crisis, other than siphoning off resources and bandwidth and attention span, is annexation more likely now? Is the crisis being used as cover for settlement activity, for home demolitions, or is it simply not connected in your view?
Well, I think it's a little bit preliminary to know exactly how it's connected, but I can think of a few ways in which it is. Some, bad, some better, depending on your perspective, of course. I think the first obvious way that we're all, maybe not paying attention to, but I am, is that there's practically a news blackout in Israel. I don't know how the news is in Palestine, but all we hear for the first, for an hour of news every single night on 3 different Israeli television channels is COVID. I would say 70% of that is about COVID in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community. And maybe, if we're lucky, 3 to 5 minutes worth of political news coverage. I don't know if you agree with me, but I find it very worrying that all other news items, even, the basic repetition of, the problematic elements of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, we're not even getting that. And I had to, dig deep inside the newspapers to know that there is I think through colleagues on Twitter, to know that some settlers are trying to set up a new neighborhood outside Hebron today. But none of this coverage is accessible now, which I find very worrying because we just don't know. Now, that's on the bad side of things. And I think that also what's going on in the Palestinian, certainly in the West Bank, which is controlled by Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, is severe economic hardship, like everywhere. Crashing tax revenue. Israel is going to do some emergency, I don't know if it's a loan or some sort of a plan to help them, maintain some of their budget. But I think that puts the PA in a much more precarious situation, and it was already in a precarious situation. Of course, Mahmoud Abbas was even in a more well, it's hard to know who was in a more precarious situation, Abbas or the PA itself. But this is certainly not, good for their standing among Palestinian society. And I think the INSS has often pointed out what would happen. It wouldn't take much for them to collapse, and that would easily be an excuse or a reality that somebody needs to govern there if there's no PA. So those are all in the negative scenario sides. On the more positive side, I think that there is a general, a broad sense of acceptance. And I say a sense as a public opinion researcher. When I say a sense, I usually have data behind it, even if I can't discuss all of the data. But I think you feel it also in terms of how the issues are being covered, which is that it's sort of legitimate for Israel and the Israeli authorities and the military and the civilian authorities to be coordinating, not only with the Palestinian Authority, but even with Hamas and Gaza. We hear this, it's sort of been part of the general understanding that Israel is in some sort of cooperation, even if we don't know the details of it. And I think that, the COVID has taken over so much of our normal daily life priorities that it's like even, the normal kind of total ban on doing anything with Hamas has been suspended because of the need to coordinate over health policy. And now there's some sort of talk, which is of course politically, maneuvered in terms of timing, that Hamas might actually strike a deal with Netanyahu for exchange of information about prisoners and people and Israelis who are missing in Gaza. Certainly he'll be using that for political purposes. But if this opens up an understanding among Israeli and Palestinian societies that they have absolutely shared overlapping interests that cannot be separated, a health crisis, which I'm already hearing commentators sort of pulling it into a general sense of shared environmental crises. I think that could generate a change of consciousness and eventually legitimize greater cooperation, including on the Israeli side, where it's, maybe not appreciated, but also on the Palestinian side, where anti-normalization can be very powerful, and maybe lay the groundwork for cooperation over things like environmental policy, health policy. Alongside those, you will need cooperation on infrastructure, and ultimately the realization that the two populations are sharing a geographic space. They will probably have to always share some infrastructure and maybe even some bits of their sovereignty, which is where I diverge from the typical two-state partition approach in favor of a more cooperative two-state solution based on some form of shared sovereignty. In my vision, it's a confederation of two states, but we can talk about that another time. But I think that if this moves in the direction of seeing the two communities seeing themselves as having very interdependent relationship, that could bode better for the future.
Great, thanks. I want to turn to some audience questions. First to Ari, the issue of Iran hasn't come up yet in our discussion, but it has come up in some of the questions. Obviously, Iran is facing a very serious COVID crisis, with the highest number of incidents and deaths in the region. Does the COVID crisis in Iran, and given Israel's posture in the region, does it increase or decrease the threat that Iran poses, in your view, in the region?
So I think presumably some of those conventional threats from Iran have slowed down. I don't think it's necessarily because the Iranians have opted to do so. I think the Iraqi PMUs, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they're smart, they're probably avoiding their Iranian counterparts based on sort of the high level at which Corona has taken out people in Iran, really at the level of advisor to the supreme leader. I think that the coronavirus handling probably also has tarnished Iran's reputation. I think in addition to that, the recent Soleimani assassination has done so. But I don't think that means that the partnerships of convenience that Iran has throughout the region will evaporate. I think at the same time that despite some of the difficulties that Iran will face because of the coronavirus crisis and its handling of that, I think that there's also need to be very wary of what Iran might do when the rest of the world is distracted. I think at the present time, they're slowly creeping toward the nuclear threshold. And I think that there's a possibility that they could do something like a nuclear breakout or a nuclear sneak out during the time when the rest of the world is distracted. I think we've already seen examples of world leaders deciding to do something like that in Russia. In Russia, we saw Putin extend his potential presidency until 2036. Barely heard a peep on that, and I think that that sets a very dangerous precedent for what Iran might try to replicate.
I wanted to turn to Dalia. Dalia, you've written that Israel has always had an ambiguous relationship with democracy in terms of illiberalism, majoritarianism in general. Where do you see Israel's democracy going forward? And I want to put the same question to all of you. We have about 8 minutes left. So where do things go from here in terms of Israeli democracy?
Okay,
What
I'm
is,
happy
or
to...
you know, to put another way, what is the greatest threat to Israel's democracy that you see right now?
Okay, I want to get into that, but I just want to acknowledge that somebody asked a question for me on the Iran issue. So I'll just follow up very briefly, which was, could a worsening scenario between the US and Iran be a deterrent to Netanyahu's plans for annexation? It's a little bit hypothetical. My general instinct is not really, because if there's some sort of an escalation with Iran, I mean, I imagine that Israel will use it as cover to continue moving ahead in incremental forms of annexation, unless an American president were specifically to ask Israel not to, and that would have to be somebody who's probably not Donald Trump. So that's my very, very short input on that. In terms of Israeli democracy, I think the greatest threat right now to Israeli democracy is the combined the combination of an undermining of the legitimacy and the role, the actual role of the judiciary in Israel, alongside the growing formalization of Israel's control over Palestinians in the West Bank and effective control over Gaza, which is what the UN has called Israel's role in surrounding and controlling most of what goes in and out of Gaza and everything in terms of travel. We should really, make this clear. Even today, Israel controls ultimately, pretty much everything about, life for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, other than internal, very local things like planning. So that's already a non-democratic situation. Those people don't have the right to vote for the people for the government that has ultimate control over their fate. But even within that, what we still see are democratic institutions, like a balance of power, like 3 different branches of government that theoretically allows for an opposition to change Israel's direction. The more you undermine the rule of law, which has been going on in Israel for a long time, definitely accelerated under Netanyahu's rule, but actually started before that. And we're seeing similar things in other countries. The less you have that arena in which to challenge these policies, either if you're Palestinian or whether you're an advocate at a human rights organization inside Israel, or simply a political, group that opposes the policy of annexation, you have less and less opportunity to do that if the standing of the Supreme Court is demoted in Israeli society, or if the Israeli government passes a law saying that it can override a Supreme Court ruling or even cancel the right of judicial review altogether. Actually, let's be precise. It's not a right of judicial review. It's something that the court does. But the fact is, if the judiciary is kind of clipped in that sense, then there will be very little opportunity for protesting the policy of continuing to formalize Israel's undeclared today control over the Palestinians in ways that are not democratic, because you'll have, if you have annexation, you'll have two levels of citizens and residents. Citizens have full civil rights. Residents are, we don't know. I mean, the Israeli government does not want to talk about what the status will be for Palestinians who are living under annexed areas. You can hear lots of competing theories that I want to give my colleagues time to talk, so I won't go into all of them. But there are very few scenarios that envision giving all the Palestinians who are currently controlled by Israel and who may be formally controlled by Israel anything like full citizenship with national voting rights. So I don't think you can separate the two threats to the undermining of the judiciary and the incremental advance of annexation.
I think that's a good point to put the question to you. What is the future of Israeli democracy as you see it?
Mute.
Unmute, please.
Unmute.
Unmute, please.
Yes, sorry. I think it's we have to be clear about the fact that what we are talking today about the future of democracy of Israel. We are on a crisis situation in democracy in Israel. Democracy is facing a crisis, and it can be shifted into a situation where we can rebuild or build a real substantial democracy, or we can just, renovate what is left from the official democracy that existed till today in Israel. And I agree totally with Dalia that there is no way to speak about annexation and to speak about continuous control of another people and expect that there will be democracy in Israel. Even after the Jewish nation state law, the possibility, it's not only about the situation of the Palestinians in the occupied territory. It's all today. Israel is not having equal citizenship for all of its citizens. I am not an equal citizen. I don't look only on the situation of the ability to elect and to participate in elections as this is only the formal side of the democracy. We are talking about a real democracy where our citizenship is fully, even this formal side of the democracy is under threat with all the incitement, and we saw it this time when there was even an attack on those who even got the idea that we might be able, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, to influence the political map in Israel. As long as our political participation and right of election, as if the formal democracy did not influence the situation in Israel, it was okay. So I think that we are on a crossroad. Either Israel is going toward rapidly to an apartheid regime, even toward its Palestinian citizens in Israel, not only those in the occupied territory, or there would be a possibility to build something different and a real democracy. It depends very much in what is going to happen and what kind of government and how long it's going to last. If it is 1 year heading back to election or what.
Thank you, Ida. We have about a minute, so I want to turn to Ari and put the last question to you. We have a number of questions that have come from the audience about alternatives to a two-state solution. And since you made the point that the two-state solution was the best, was the worst solution except for all other solutions. But one question is, how do we know that a two-state solution is in fact the best if we haven't really talked about the alternatives? Dalia has talked about confederation. Some questioners have talked about a one-state solution. Tell us, if you can, in a minute, why the two-state solution is why we haven't discussed alternatives to a two-state solution, given the many challenges to it at this time.
Sure. So I'm going to try and address two things. One is the question that you asked just now, and then also I'd like to address the issue of whether the coronavirus, how it will affect Israel's democracy. I'm going to go for that one first. And I think that Israel's certainly at a moment where it faces some democratic challenges, but I'm going to end on a relatively optimistic note. I think it's true that the COVID virus could provide cover for action to expand powers of the government beyond what they should in any democratic society. But I also think that the coronavirus is, and the responses by respective governments is the best advertisement for democracy that is out there. I think that you look at the responses of Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, and you compare them to what you're going to see in authoritarian states. I think the situation is going to be pretty rough in Russia. I think you're going to see pretty high toll in Turkey, Egypt, and I think we probably will not know exactly what happened in China. So I think that ultimately, when people see that democracies are better able to cope with these types of threats than authoritarian regimes, I think that hopefully it will sort of turn the global tide away from sort of a slow creep towards authoritarianism towards something that is more in favor of Western-style democracy. Regarding the different possible solutions, so I would say that, I mean, INSS has done a pretty extensive research project on this. I would invite any listener who's interested in seeing what the other potential solutions are to read the INSS program that was published, I think, in 2018 about what can be done in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. I would also say that just speaking off the cuff, I mean, there are, I think, four obvious possibilities. I think there's the two-state solution. I think there is a one-state solution that looks like an apartheid state. I think there's a one-state solution that looks like a state in which the Israelis and Palestinians have been merged into one confederate, one polity, which I think is all. Both of the previous two are extreme. Both of the one-state solutions are extremely problematic in my view, and unlikely to work. And then, of course, there's the continuation of just managing the conflict, which I think is something that is feasible, but I don't think that it's desirable. I think ultimately Israel would like to be and should be a state that's secure, democratic, Jewish, and morally just. And I think that the continuation of the conflict is not really conducive to those foundational values. And I think that if we can find a solution and work with the Palestinians to implement it, then we could all be better off.
Thank you, Ari. I appreciate all of you. Thank you, Ari Heistein. Thank you, MK Aida Tuma Sleiman. Thank you, Dr. Dalia Scheindlin. We're all out of time now. I'm sorry we've only scratched the surface on so many of these issues, but thank you once again for a fascinating discussion, and thank you to the audience for joining us. And with that, we will sign off.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.